Hello, hello. It's official, it's real, it's happening. Hello. TD Bank, Stuart Keeler, and the Senior Curator of the TD Bank Art Collection. Many of you didn't know that TD Bank was founded in the 1850s in Canada, and the American branch of the bank was founded in 1909. But in terms of collecting art, we've been doing that since 1963. 1963. Over 6,000 pieces of art, over 1,000 locations across North America. But we're not here to talk about TD Art Collection. We're here to talk about our esteemed guests who I've gotten a privilege to know recently. We are joined by Jenée-Daria Strand, who is a Floridian, but now has decamped to New York City with a great resume of Brooklyn Museum, White Columns, and now with the New York Public Art Fund. Correct? Yeah. How did I do it? Good. Okay. And we are with her colleague and another great artist, critic, curator, editor, art critic, the director of the Pérez Museum here in Miami. And this is not about me. This is about them. I'm going to hand this over to you, Jenny, for a really interesting conversation and context. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. I'd love to start our conversation with this idea of institutional reinvention. In the past few years, we've seen a need for museums to expand their function beyond the function of their walls and beyond the anchorage of their spaces. And in many ways, I feel as though I've witnessed from afar PAMM being this beacon of reinventing the museum and then for the needs of its audience, responding to a need both locally, nationally, and then globally. I think that PAMM is unique in that reinvention doesn't look like starting over. It doesn't look like scratching what's on the surface, so scratching what's inside of the institution, but rather doubling down on an ethos that has been present since its formation and since its beginning. I'd love for you to speak, Franklin, about the principles that currently guide PAMM's programs, its collections, and how that's anchored in the ethos of its founding.
Awesome. Thank you. Again, am I on? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Hi, everybody. Good to see everybody. It's Friday of our week. I'm really tired. I'm waiting for y'all to go home. I'm just kidding. I want to thank Heather and Nada and everyone at TD, especially for doing this. And Jenée, such a pleasure to be in conversation with you and to see your trajectory, and congratulations on everything that you're doing in New York right now. It gives us all hope for the future. So thank you for doing that and engaging me in this conversation. And I think, and I want to thank the translators as well. And I think I should say, just as we look where we are, this is a kind of idyllic setting, right? This ain't the convention center, thankfully. So you set up a different way of approaching the work. I just slide through the door, I'm in the middle of the space. It is a different way of engaging people, and I think it's a warm and welcoming way of engaging people. And so that's what we're trying to do. Just to touch on a couple of the things you mentioned, in terms of creating a space that is welcoming for visitors. I got lucky. We have, I think, a pretty amazing building done by Herzog & de Meuron. The building is only 10 years old. Obviously, location-wise, we sit directly on Biscayne Bay. I think Frost's Museum of Science is an amazing place and looks amazing and does different things architecturally, but with our location, we're able to create spaces like this, like that, right? So you go from this through the doors of the museum space, and you cross a little threshold, but you're always reminded that you're actually in this, right? It's surrounded by glass. So that's some of the kind of structural architecture that helps us do what we do. When you talk about what we've tried to do, and I love that you mentioned, we're not trying to reinvent a wheel. We began as a museum in January of 1984. So in some ways, some people might say that's a history. Like for Miami, that's old history, right? 40 years almost. Most places it wouldn't be. Toronto, it wouldn't be. New York, Boston. So we feel like we have a relationship to the contemporary that is different than those kinds of older institutions, and that puts us in a position to be of the moment in a way, and to be of the time that we're living in. We started at a time in Miami that also, I think, was dominated, let's say, by media images that would suggest that things weren't so rosy, right? There's a Time magazine cover from 1983 that says "Paradise Lost." My own visual history of Miami in 1984 was via Miami Vice, right? So it's drugs, it's violence. It's also cool, and it looks kind of fun. There's the water everywhere. So that's the kind of background, and I think our founding director, a guy named Jan van der Mark, who came from the Netherlands and worked in several institutions in the United States, actually was at the MCA Chicago in late 1960s. Came and he recognized that museums can be a place for people to come together, specifically in a place where they might not understand each other, and I think that was part and parcel of that time. Lots of people coming from lots of different places for various reasons, not necessarily coming because they wanted to, because they were forced to by the circumstances of where they lived in other places. And so how do we understand each other in that moment? And art can be a way for us to bridge those kind of divides. So the first project he did was a project that takes advantage of this location. Surrounded islands with Christo and Jean-Claude, pink fabric surrounding 11 of the islands in Biscayne Bay. It took 4,000 people to do that. And in my mind, before I moved here, I thought maybe this thing must have lasted like a year. And in truth, it only lasted 2 weeks. But it created so many images, and they, of course, the way that they were able to do the projects they did was by fundraising themselves, by sharing the artwork, making small collages, making photographs that people could purchase that would go toward the execution of the project. So that was already involving people. You already have a fundraising position within this project, not so expensive, a proposition that would allow many people to be involved financially, and then more people to be involved in taking the fabric from the factory in Hialeah to the bay, bringing it out into the water together, surrounding the islands. It took a lot of civic permission, a lot of governmental permission. So essentially it was a project, an art project, that was a people project. And that's what we've tried to really lean into. I mean, I think it's worth saying that also because you work in art in public place. We have, that's our ground here, is art in public places in Miami has been existing for 40-something years. And the first time Ed Ruscha did a real public art project, it was here. 30-something paintings rimming around the Miami Public Library. Klaus Oldenburg and Kosher van Brugge, big orange, appealing orange that actually doubles as a fountain, and it sits directly in front of government's center, so where the mayors and the commissioners are. And that's also where we first opened. So we've only been in this building for 10 years. Obviously the location of it allows for us to double down on the things that already exist.
And I love that you start with the opacity of sight, right? Like the opacity of the physical site that's surrounding the building, thinking about how you can see outside as you're inside, but also how that translates to interaction and conversation, and then this extension of community, and the many versions of community, many definitions of community, as we see it in Miami and otherwise. I'm also thinking about...
No, I was just going to say, so it also lends itself perfectly to every Thursday of this week, in that we had George Clinton performing last night, and there were 6,000 people there to hear him, but also to convene with each other.
And I love that as we're situating ourselves in locale and in geography, Miami also becomes an extension of Latin America and around the Caribbean because of its position geographically within the US, but also because of the physicality of bodies that have transferred themselves to this incredible city. And so I want to talk about how its proximity, PAMM's proximity, Miami's proximity to Latin America, how that then infuses itself into your programs, your collection, and the ways in which you lead the institution.
It's absolutely 100% integral. Thank you for bringing that up. And I think it was always there to a degree, but what we've tried to do is really lean into the idea that, first and foremost, nobody should have a better Cuban art collection than us, right? I mean, the circumstances would say that we benefited from so many artists who have come to make Miami what it is. And so we need to be the best, I think, in representing them. And so that has been paramount. And we've been able to do that. Of course, it helps when you have somebody like George Pérez, who has also made that part of his own mission. So together we've been able to do that. And as you said, with the proximity to Latin America and the Caribbean, we've got to be able to present, to the best that we can, and I think that should be better than anywhere else. We recently started the Caribbean Cultural Institute with the backing of the Mellon Foundation, and it's something that I think we hold very dear, and allows for us to do things in that space that can't get done other places. We'll have a performance of a Wilda Sterling tomorrow at the museum at 2 o'clock. A Puerto Rican artist who's a woman in performance art for a very long time, who has recently gotten the kind of accolade she probably should have gotten long ago. It's a constant for us. Like, that part has to always be there. You should always be able to come to the museum and see something that is representative of that space. And I think likewise, we look then beyond to the African diaspora and thinking through where we are in relationship to that space, thinking about the deep ties that we have to Haiti being in Miami. We've got to be able to do that too. So we've tried to make that front and center.
And I've seen and heard you say in other spaces that context is everything. And so to have Marcela Cantuaria in conversation with Yayoi Kusama in the same building, that changes your approach from one artist to the other, one practice to the other. I would love to hear you speak more about that.
Oh yeah, thank you. But yeah, and I think that's the thing about, like, we kind of throw this word around, and sometimes I sometimes shirk from it, and sometimes I really embrace it, is that we consider ourselves to be flagship, if you will. And so we're trying to do a lot of different things for many different audiences. So when you walk into the museum now, you may go past or through actually a large work by the Venezuelan Jesus Rafael Soto, The Penetrable, this big blue hanging string thing that everybody has so much fun inside of, and you get to transverse through it. So you go through there, and if you come into the museum space, if you go to the left, there's a gallery that's dedicated to abstraction, right? Let's just think in real basic art historical tenets. There's not a Met down the street. We're trying to talk about art history at the same time as we're moving into contemporary. So it's abstraction, but it's done through the eyes of Latin America. And it's also done through the eyes of where we are, right? So Carmen Herrera, who a lot of people started talking about recently, I was amazed when I came here 8 years ago, when you go to private collections here, and she was everywhere. 8 years ago, and I should have, well, whatever, that's a different story. We all should have, right? We all have one we missed. But now, needless to say, I think, she's had public projects in New York, she's had the big show at the Whitney. Lots of people know the work now, but she is a part of this place. Lolo Soldevilla, who was 20 years older than her, and did not leave the island, but was more a part of the island. And the work was not so well known, so now we have them in the same gallery space together with many other artists. Then when you come around the other side, then we got to talk about representation and figuration, and a lot of ideas that people see themselves to. When we talk about representation, it's not just describing how one paints a picture, but what the person who is viewing sees from that picture. So there are artists like Kehinde Wiley is up in that gallery, Jordi Castile is up in that gallery, Chris O'Feely is up in that gallery, Lisa Butler is up in that gallery, Carrie Mae Weems. So we're trying to also address that, but through a very specific lens. It shouldn't be what you're going to see in New York, and I think that's one way to go about that.
And it sounds like in the affect of that, it's not that it's abstraction and Latin America, but rather Latin America, the Caribbean, the African diaspora is central, and also there are these mechanisms and tentacles through which the work happens.
Exactly. I mean, at base, it's just about different ways of seeing, right? It's abstraction. We all have thoughts that we can't quite describe or name. and then we have a representational image that gives us something that we can anchor to maybe a little bit more readily. But we need both of those things to actually think and live. And so it's about that before it's about where does it come from, or who's the artist that made it.
And
I didn't even talk about Marcelo, I'm sorry.
no, please.
So obviously, with that connection to Latin America that you spoke about, and if you're going to be connected to the Caribbean and to the diaspora, then Brazil makes a big important statement about that. It's super important. And so Marcelo is just one of many artists working in that space that we've collected, but also that exhibition right now I think is a real harbinger of a contemporary artist, a contemporary moment, and a very special person who's working right now, not only there, but in the world, who's doing things with their art that is really generous. It really involves the participation of a lot of other people. She's always using other fellow artists in her work and in her process, and always trying to provide a space for more than just herself. In addition to the fact that she also speaks really politically about things that are going on in the world, and in particular about the environment and as it relates to Brazil, but even bigger than that. And to put that in position with somebody like Kusama, and let's be real, Kusama you could put in the forest and people come. It is what it is, right? It has a translation now that allows for people to say, oh, I know this. It goes back to that idea of, oh, I understand this, I see this before. And so when you have that level of comfort, it makes you feel like, oh, I can go to this museum, even though I don't go to museums, I don't care about museums, but I got Kusama literally on me from Louis Vuitton, or I've seen the dots, and those kind of things translate in a way that is, I think, popular, and allows for us to hopefully, and it has actually brought a lot of people into the museum that would not necessarily come otherwise.
It's the impetus of familiarity that then leads to exploration, is what it sounds like.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I remember in like reviewing your trajectory into the art world, that's exactly sort of what created your bridge, is seeing Basquiat on the cover and thinking about this this link between the greats that you saw in your father's collection and the graffiti that you saw in the streets of New York, visiting Harlem, visiting Studio Museum, visiting the Met, going to school across from there, but also then seeing this artist that bridged these two worlds for you. And I'm wondering, what is sort of your advice to folks who are looking for their point of entry into that?
I don't know. That's a good question. I should ask you that. I don't know. It depends on what. Like for me, it was more like, the music of a moment. I think there's also a thing like what I love as being a universal idea, and I think what Marcella embodies a lot is pure the angst of youth, right? No matter where you are in the world, our youth are trying to fight against tradition or against whatever the prevailing attitudes are, and we always need that. We need it more now more than ever. And so for me, it was that was the punk aspect of it, right? And when you talk about that image, I mean, this is a very specific image. 1985. It was actually an article called "New Art, New Money," and it was talking about many artists who were coming into a lot of money, right? We talk about that now in some ways. But Basquiat was the cover of that article, and so he had on this suit, and he had no shoes, so he's kind of playing into people's like fake kind of ideas around the quote unquote primitivism and all that kind of stuff. But it was all in his hands, though. It was like he was playing them in a way. So I just love that image, and it also spoke to the fact of graffiti in that it was about text. And I come from a writing background, so that was the personal aspect of that. And so to see that also gives you the sense again of that representation thing where, oh yeah, I can do this, I know people who do this. You have a parlance or an entry like you spoke about that feels familiar, at least for a beginning. So I think it's always somehow personal, always somehow goes back to the personal and the uniqueness of each one of us as human beings. Nobody sees or hears things exactly the same way.
And as we are in an art fair context, I would love to talk more about collection practices. You touched briefly on the hits and misses when developing a collection, especially for an institution, but I would love to speak about something that you said in another space, which is collecting is an active practice, it's not passive. And so for the collectors in the room, could you speak more about what an active practice of collecting looks like and how that might change the art ecosystem at large?
Yeah, a little bit. So there are tenants, and we're lucky. So I'm going to speak from the institutional aspect first. So since we did lay out those tenants, or that idea of mission being grounded thoroughly in being a museum that is global in its approach, but led from here, right? So we call it a Miami lens, which then leads us to wanting to present the work of Latin America and the Caribbean really, really well. That then fits into how we go about collecting, and I think we're really fortunate. We have a partnership here at NADA where we get to acquire a work, and so we've acquired a new work. I think it was here. Hey. Right, at Hannah's gallery,
Yeah.
right? At Hannah Traor's gallery, who I'd seen in New York. But then our curators come over and make the selection, and it's like we're looking at an image, right, of trans person in Colombia, right? And so we're in our space. We're in the space of where we are. We're in the space where we know that we can put that photograph up in context. Marcella, I mean, that's a perfect example. It would work in there. It would work in many different ways. We've shown so many Colombian artists as well, like to Doris Salcedo, through Carlos Mota, through many, many others. And so there's that context also, if you wanted to link it a little bit close to home. But then it goes beyond. And there's also, I think, the idea, which often comes to the fore here at NADA, is the idea of the emerging, and the idea that we want to be flagship again. And this is where it gets complicated sometimes, flagship, right? So, there's a 1970 Philip Guston hanging up right now. That's pretty rather established, let's say. But we want to be able to continue building on that space and on that tone in the present. And that means taking some chances. I saw 2 paintings just now, forget where, by Jameson Green. And they're totally different from what we collected. They're wonderful. Great younger artist, I think he's from Dallas maybe. But we bought this one that is almost like these 2 clan figures playing chess or something. It's really weird. But it's like the Guston a little bit, because our Guston that we borrowed. We borrowed that from Denver Art Museum because we don't have that. 1970 Guston of the figures that he made, which are like himself with the clan outfit on. In the studio, painting. Crazy. And then Gary Sirmans is up right now, which also in his early work from 1989, 1990, he was addressing a similar thing. So trying to collect in order to strengthen at all times the foundation that you've created. And I think institutionally we have to do that, otherwise we'll be all over the place, and we can't say things like, if you are interested in Latin American art and you don't come to see us, then you're not really interested, right? So we want to be able to say that kind of thing, and so we have to collect in that fashion. And I think the collecting is, as it is for personal collectors, it's a way of stating who you are. It's a symbol of your values and what you consider to be ideal. And so that's what we're trying to do with every single acquisition. And I think personally, my wife and I do that also, right, Jeff? We're trying to figure out what it is that is reflective of us, or what it is that we want our daughter to see, or what it is we want people to see when they come to our home. And so if you lead from that idea that you're trying to say something through that, then I think you collect in a way that is sustainable and always valuable, regardless of what the marketplace is.
Thank you. And to go back to Camila's acquisition, just to further expand, PAMM every year for the past 6 years, has acquired one work from Nada. And so this year they acquired an image by Camila Falquez, who was showing with Hannah Traoré Gallery. And it's not lost on me how just monumental that acquisition is, because it's part of the TD Bank Curated Spotlight. Also to say that it's a monumental moment because it's a flagship institution that's also embodying this idea of reciprocity, not only with the artist, with the gallery, but also with this space of Nada. And so I would love for you to talk more about what reciprocity means and looks like within a flagship institution.
Okay, thank you for that question. I think right now, one of the things that we can do, being, I don't know, I'll say, so as low, I was about to say as large as we are, but you don't know what I'm talking about. So we have about a $15 million budget. We employ 100 people on full-time staff, and then another 100 is contracted. So we're what's considered medium to large. Like, we're not encyclopedic, right? We're not Lackmer Art Institute or any of that, but we're more on the lines of the modern and the contemporary. And so we're covering 100 some odd years, just to give a sense of scale. So within Miami in particular, we have a position where we can strengthen our own element of what we do while strengthening others. And what I mean by that is that I think as a museum, we already got past the point where it's like, this is not a place only for certain people to come to see a great painting, right? That's cool, but that's not everything. It's how you act with the work, it's how you use the work. And I see my education director, Marie Vickles, is over here. So this is what we, it has to have a life that is programmable, a life that people can see online, a life that people can read about elsewhere. It has to play a role in people's lives beyond just being on the wall. And so one thing that allows us to do, it allows us to bring in other people. And collaboration is key. So we work with Third Horizon, which is a more Caribbean-based filmmaking organization. So we would, we don't do that as well. We don't do it at all. And they do it really, really well. So we'll do a series of films with them every 2 times a year. We can collaborate with more even social service inclined organizations, like a Lotus, or we've worked with the Lynx on a project called Art Detectives, which allows for kids to come into the museum and engage with artworks along with police in order to talk about how we see things differently, because clearly we see things differently. So those kind of things, I think, is what is important moving forward as a museum space, not just ours, but many museums, right? In order to have an active role in people's daily life, which is what we're really trying to do. Just believing that the power of art is something that everyone should have accessibility to. That's part of it.
Thank you. All my questions for you. Thank you.
You have the best question.
Thank you. And happy to take questions from the audience if folks have inquisitions or anything that you'd like to also ask or bring.
I loved when you said music of the moment, which has political and social ramification, which is something very interesting to the bank itself, as we are a community-focused organization. In terms of how art can begin doing that in this moment we are in, I know it's a very broad, it sounds smarter than maybe it actually is, but I know that you, both as thinkers, I'd like to hear your leadership just on that.
I think just being in the live space, bringing people together, that's the main part. So, last night brought together a lot of people. Tomorrow, another program at 2 o'clock will bring together a lot of people. and just allow people who don't necessarily find themselves in the same spaces to interact that's part of the big part, right? If we all understood each other a little bit better, then the world would probably be a whole lot better. And so being from this, foundational position here in Miami, I think we're equipped to maybe deal with that question a little bit better than other places. I don't know. I'm probably giving Miami too much credit. But I think there is something to that. And then the other thing is like the guidance of artists can't ever be overstated, because their whole job is to think about things that most of us don't think about on a daily basis, and to just keep thinking about it and keep doing something to it, as they say. And so a Christo and Jean-Claude project. How do you end up with something like that? I'm not sure, but that's why we're engaged with people like Marcella and with artists like Awilda, who will be performing tomorrow. Those kind of things, I think, are give us at least a space for more in-depth engagement amongst humans to happen.
Any other questions?
You're talking about the value of people being in space together, and you said in the same moment, right? And you're also talking about permanent collections. How do you think about those time scales in terms of building community and then long-term impact, and maybe like a space in between? How do you think about those as you build an institutional program that's cohesive?
One way is the digital, because it's never off, it's always on, and it transmits everywhere and all times. I think obviously we all have things that we would consider to be positives that came out of our experience with COVID, right? And so that accelerated our ability to speak digitally by, 5-6 years at least. So we have more of a vibrant way of participating in that space. We actually just opened a show online with a great curator, Barbara London, who was at MoMA for many years and basically established their video department. So she just curated a show for us online, and it exists in that space. And there's a whole conversation happening around that at the same time that isn't necessarily in person. And I think that is one way of continuing to build in a kind of, I think you're alluding to interstitial spaces, not necessarily in this moment of great activity, but what's happening along the way. And as far as the collection building goes, it begins with things like this, and with acquiring work that you don't totally understand from the very beginning, but you're intrigued enough and you believe in it enough that there's going to be something to say or do with it in the future. And I think that's what we got. So, and I know that's what we got. We got that with Camilla's work. We got that a couple of years ago with Kenny Rivero's work. We got that with Patrick Dean Hubbell's work. I mean, the Patrick Dean Hubbell work we bought last year is actually on view in the museum right now. And it's one of the reasons why the installation, which was done by our chief curator, Gilbert Vicario, it's all about Latin America and its relationship to indigeneity. And so Patrick's work speaks directly to that. So yeah, it's part of it is you're not always certain, but you have some degree of faith in the artist and in the art.
Maybe one last burning question.
What's your next project?
So as aforementioned, I'm the assistant curator at Public Art Fund, and I have the pleasure of just taking on that role. I've been there for the past year. For the next iteration of our series of programs, I'll be working on Huma Bahaba's new series of works at Brooklyn Bridge Park. She'll create 4 new sculptures that are really incredible, and an extension of her practice. I'll be working on Adra Soto, an incredible artist based in Chicago.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, just announced. She'll be making a new body of work for Central Park And I'll also be curating my own show with Adrienne Elise Tarver, who has a booth up at Basel currently with one in Cora Gallery. She'll be making new works across our bus shelter program, which are physical bus furniture within New York, Boston, and Chicago, over 300 bus shelters in total. So that's me. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
for this conversation. This moment is not lost on me. Thank you sincerely. Thank you, Heather, Zach, DW, Stuart, both NADA team and also TD Bank team for this opportunity, this moment, and this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think they wanted this part. So let me start by saying thank you, Heather, as always. It's an amazing partnership that we have with NADA. It really brings our TD Ready commitment to life. And I want to say to Jenée and Franklin, when I was 12 and at a new age now, I'm still very nosy. And I love to sit in a conversation where I can go back to my childhood and I feel like I'm peeking through the stairs and my mom and her aunts are having this deep conversation and I'm trying to just figure it out. So thank you for sharing with such authenticity and truth. I also want to thank my colleagues and our regional leadership, Nick Maselli, who's our regional president here today. Why is TD Bank here? We believe in this. All the words you talked about today, access, and it's really for us about creating a sense of belonging in your community. Everyone should feel access to the arts. We're behind it, we're supporting it, and we just thank you for the opportunity to work with you. So congratulations to everyone on such a successful event.